Hi, and welcome to Reimagining Film Curation with the Programmers of Color Collective. My name is Lucy Jane Mukerjee. I'm a film curator for the Tribeca Film Festival and a queer activist. I'm going to introduce you in a moment to 4 members of the Programmers of Color Collective, which is a professional development group for film curators of color around the world. We are dedicated to creating community, opportunities, and better working conditions. Let me do that again. We are dedicated to creating community, opportunities, and better working conditions for film curators of color around the world. The collective currently has 300 members globally and will soon be launching an online member directory in order to dispel the myth that qualified, experienced film festival programmers of color don't exist. The goal of the collective is programming inclusion. We're asking film festivals to reflect on their staff and take a more intersectional approach to their hiring practices. We believe that only when your programming team represents an inclusive array of intersectional identities will your festival be able to achieve a rich, diverse lineup of content. If you're a film festival leader wondering how you can do better, this is how. Hire us. Now I'm going to introduce our 4 guests who are going to be sharing what they've learned over the course of their careers and their perspective on the art of film curation. Heitor Augusto is a film programmer, film critic, and lecturer focused on mapping and elevating the presence of Black Brazilians in cinema. Faridah Gbadamosi is the director of programming for the Coven Film Festival, a festival that showcases work by marginalized genders, as well as the lead programmer at OUTstream and the US Indies Programming Fellow at Mill Valley. Mwachiro is a writer, journalist, podcaster, and a queer activist. He's the co-founder of the Out Film Festival, which is the first LGBTQI film festival in East Africa. And Hebe Tabachnik has been a film curator, producer, and festival consultant for 20 years. She's the artistic director for Cine Latino Minneapolis and a senior programmer for Seattle, Palm Springs, and Cartagena film festivals. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you.
As I was reading your impressive backgrounds, I was realizing the wealth of expertise that goes into film curation, how the work we do is informed by a lifelong awareness of the cinematic ecosystem, including film funding, film criticism, film distribution, and production. So I wanted to start off with a question for everybody. What is it about film curation that you love? When you're working with the festival, what parts of the job bring you the most joy? What do you wish you could do or see more of?
I'm going to jump the gun here, since I have to say that I'm going to say only this. I learned to tell my story through the stories of others. And that's something that really gave me such a joy. And the journey of discovery, I always say that I feel very blessed when I get to see films. Sometimes the films we see may not end up in a festival. So we have a privilege of actually getting, and I always give this idea of getting into this obscure cave where you find all this material that you can, go through and enjoy and get into. And it's really, it's being blessed by, this opportunity. But like I said, I'm a filmmaker. I went to film school. I thought I was going to be telling my own stories. And I'm not saying I won't do that in the future, but I learned how powerful it is when you select films, because you are telling your story and you're telling who you are, what you believe in, what your ethic in life and in art is. And, you know, by giving a platform to other storytellers, you are elevating them and you're elevating yourself. So, you know, that's my, you know, connection with programming, because I never thought I was going to be a programmer. That was kind of by chance. But once I started, I found this, you know, immense, you know, wealth and joy that I didn't even think it existed.
Beautiful, thank you. Anybody else want to share what they love about curation?
I enjoy the journey. For me, it's a journey, especially programming queer film in this part of the world. I love seeing how queerness is represented in different parts of the world. And I love the fact that we have, through the Art Film Festival, are giving people an opportunity to see themselves, to see how their queerness is represented in different parts. So for me, it is an honor to be able to put together a program like that. I love the fact, I just get so excited that we will get an opportunity we'll get an opportunity to show our audience that it's okay to be queer. It's an opportunity for visibility in an area where we don't, in a country where we don't see much of our own visibility. So for me, it's a fantastic journey. I recognize that it is an honor, but yet again, on the other hand, there is still that risk, especially where we live in a homophobic country. You know, it just makes me recognize that what we're doing is risky, but for me, it's pretty worth it.
I think Kevin just spoke about visibility. So to me, it's difficult to like summarize what I love, the parts that I love about programming and selecting films and showing films. I'll just point to some things. The first thing is I see programming as a lot of things, and one of the things is shaping or helping to shape the collective imaginary. That's an Enocha concept that to me is crucial. Coming from Brazil as a Black gay Brazilian. So this is one thing. The other thing is I see programming and I approach programming as a disruptive role. I see programming as an opportunity to forge community and belonging. And now I'm speaking specifically as a Black Brazilian because I came from film criticism, like hardcore film criticism, looking at film through mise-en-scène, through the politics of authorship. So that type of knowledge, and that type of knowledge empowers you in a certain way, but it also limits you because our stories, our perspectives, our ways of being in the world, our ways of looking at film, our lives, in the end is all about our lives. They not always, or actually rarely, they are part of that history. They are seen as an integral part of that history. So I see and I approach programming as an opportunity to forge community and belonging, to show people like me, people like us, that the world of cinema and the world of moving images, whatever is the role that you're occupying in there, but the world of moving images, unlike what film history tells us, that world is also about us. That world also has space for us. So what I love about what I love about programming is kind of helping to interfere and intervene in all those things that I just mentioned. And also watching films. I mean, watching films is dope, right? and offering, like I use this term as in a very religious way, like very candomblé, Afro-Brazilian religious way, like making an offering. So offering something back to our community. So these are some of the things that make me like engage in programming.
Thank you. What about you, Faridah?
Everyone said so many wonderful things. I think for me, I have like two moments of like pure joy whenever I program. The first is when I see an image that really feels like me, because it's so rare that that happens. And I watch something and I'm like, I could see myself legitimately in this story. It's not like I have to write a new version of myself to exist in this story. I watch a story and I'm like, I can literally exist in this world because it's a world that's real to me. And that's so rare in so much content. And when I get to see that, that's always amazing. And then the second moment, which I adore even more, is when I see a story that I truly have not seen before. When I see a perspective, a feeling that I haven't had access to prior to, because like I'm from New York, I have a very intersectional identity, and I feel like my lived experience is one that is kind of being shown around the world, like that I have a very worldly point of view. And then I see something beyond myself and I'm like, oh my God, there's so much more. And I love that film gives us access to that. Like this idea that our world is so much more than our little bubble. Even when we think our bubble is massive, there's always more. And I love that film allows for us to see that, to have access to that. And programming gives me access to that because I get to watch all these stories being told by different people and get those perspectives and get those worldviews.
I love that. So we touched on identity, visibility, new perspectives, shaping the cultural conversation, creating community, all of these things, yes, are part of the joy of film curation. Thank you for sharing. I noticed that many of us in this group and in the membership of the collective as a whole have had to take on multiple roles. And I wanted to just dig into that a little bit. So one of the things that has struck me during COVID is the precariousness of our profession. To share something that challenges me, every time we send out a member newsletter to the group, we have to brace ourselves for the onslaught of auto responses and bounce backs from all the members who've been furloughed during COVID, whose jobs have been deemed non-essential and eliminated. Of course, we're now 6 months into the COVID quarantine. How are you all doing, first of all? And how has the quarantine and the impossibility of public gatherings affected your work and your livelihood? That's a big one.
Can I start? I mean, try to start, actually, because I could spend the whole afternoon talking about it. How it has impacted. I even wrote an essay about it because it's so challenging from so many points, including, for example, how do you build community virtually? How is that done? I mean, technologically, of course, that's possible, but like, how do you reach the things that you're able to reach in an in-person environment? So this is one challenge. The other challenge is, how do you program films that are quote unquote difficult to program? And difficult to program, I mean, films that showcase certain stuff that might be hurtful or might be, like, let's say, complicated images. So how do you program complicated images without the opportunity of having a face-to-face conversation or face-to-face reaction? So this is one challenge. But also difficult films in the sense of we're all so overwhelmed by having to survive whatever social status that we occupy. Most of us are like trying to survive, and as you just said, our jobs are deemed as expendable. So in this general context of anxiety, of fear, of uncertainty, how do you program films that demand more from spectatorship? Like, is it the same? Is it okay? So these are some of the things that I've been thinking since I have had to translate some of the programs that I would do in person and to a virtual environment. So I've been thinking about stuff like that. And in terms of our professional, well, that's tough. I think I won't even delve into that. I'll skip that part. I'll just talk about the positive theoretical impacts or the more theoretical aspects of it, because I mean.
Thank you for sharing that. You're right, it's a challenging one. And obviously, I'm only asking for folks to share what they're comfortable with. Was there anyone else who wanted to chime in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to state that sometimes how you feel depends on the hour and depends on the time and it depends on the day. You know, you go through quite a bit. We've just had to make a decision to, like a month ago, to make the festival virtual, you know, and that comes with so many other challenges. Mine is a volunteer position, but the fact that going virtual might give us an opportunity to dare, you know, to dare and show films that we may not have been able to show within a physical space. So I'm looking at it that way. I'm going to approach a few filmmakers whose films have been banned in Kenya and say, you know what, let's just try. But my only problem is the organization that is hosting, that hosts the film festivals, the German organization, sometimes are very diplomatic and won't want to ruffle the feathers of the authorities. But for me, it gives us an opportunity to dare and just try and program something different. I like what you said, Heitor, that, you know, difficult film, you know, and programming around difficult film. And maybe this is an opportunity for those difficult films to even go further and wider outside our own physical spaces.
Well, I love what you said, Kevin, you know, because one of the things I believe about this pandemic circumstance we're living on, and of course, I mean, hello, we're all suffering, you know, financially, and I'm, you know, completely with you, Hector, too. It's how you build this community, you know, virtually. But I really feel like we need to see the opportunity. And one of the things that it's happening with the virtual world is, and like we're planning now Cine Latino Minneapolis as we speak. And one of the things I said first is like, hey, let's get to those places that we couldn't hit before because we were showing films in the city, but they're like maybe the Latino community in the state of Minnesota are not really in the, you know, capital. They're like in smaller, you know, towns all around. And interesting enough, you know, you have a number of people that maybe never before were able to access the films, but now they will have that opportunity. So of course, we're not going to have that moment where we're all together in the same room and, you know, you have that special, this magic going on. But I see it, and, you know, I'm seeing it through other, you know, events I've been part of, where actually people that, you know, never had that specific access to a person, to a filmmaker, to a creator. Now we are, you know, I'm executive producer of a film that is going to be world premiere in Outfest. And it's led by a trans actress. And she's going to be everywhere. And she's going to be able to talk to people that maybe, even if we were, you know, in LA presenting the film, she wouldn't have been exposed, you know, and been able to dialogue with that. So I know all the hurdles. Believe me, every morning I wake up and I'm like, I don't want to get out of my bed because the obstacles, everything, it feels like bigger than me. But I try to, you know, to think of, you know, what you were saying, Kevin, the opportunities we have, the people that we might get that message out there. The motto of this year for us, for Cine Latino, is Cine Latino at home. And we're embracing this idea that, okay, you are at home, what we can do together with, you know, the films that we're showing, the conversations we're making. So, you know, it is a time where, you know, we need to be very creative. And I know we all are, you know, we're all kind of going backwards and, you know, and trying to think what else we can do to engage the audience and to get the content. And I, you know, every time I decide which kind of film I'm going to present, I'm also, you know, I hear you, Hector, saying, you know, should I, you know, try to go forward and try to show that other film that, you know, it was a little bit more difficult. At the same time, I feel like I also have a responsibility to, well, you know, that person might want to sit in front of the TV tonight to see maybe a romantic story of a, you know, of a gay character who falls in love and has a happy ending. Let's give a little bit of hope now that we have so much to suffer collectively. So, you know, it's very difficult, but I see the opportunity. I think only in 10 years we will see how profoundly sort of productive this pandemic time has been, because now we're, you know, we're in the tunnel right now. We only see a little light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow, profoundly productive. I love that. Thank you. Faridah, did you want to share anything here?
Yes. So I have a probably more like opportunistic POV than everyone else. For me, I'm relatively early in my programming career. So like the pandemic hit and like the jobs that I maybe would have applied to dried up. Everyone was holding on to whatever programmers they had available, the ones that didn't get furloughed. So this has been like a time for me to like rethink things and like look at things another way. The one thing going online has allowed for me to do is put myself in conversations like for panels and stuff like that I wouldn't have done before. Because previously I would have been spending all of my time trying to find anything, because our industry is very hard to really find a job that kind of sticks. So like this was a great opportunity for me to like expand what I thought programming involved. Some of it's having conversations, stuff like that. And then it's also an opportunity at the places where I am programming, thankfully. It's an opportunity to pitch content that they wouldn't have pitched to their audiences. I find often when I'm in programming at a space that's not specifically niche, it's really hard to get them to see, hey, this might challenge your audience. This might be the thing, this type of story may not be what they traditionally went for, but we can challenge them. But online, you can sell it as, ooh, we can bring in a new audience. This is a story that you haven't told before that maybe you wouldn't have put inside the room, but you can put online, bring in someone new, have someone else join the conversation while also challenging your current audiences. It's easier to do that online because online is like this new landscape. Scary for a lot of people, but in like an option in a way, especially for people who are from marginalized communities, because like a lot of the time we've been actively searching out stuff online. We're so good at doing that because sometimes it's the only place to find our content. We have to go looking for a web series. We have to go looking for this. So like we're used to searching for content that looks like us. So this is an opportunity for programmers to take that chance. And then this is going to sound a little cutthroat, but like, it's also an opportunity for a lot of these festivals that have kind of furloughed their staff to reimagine their staff. I know that is going to be rough for a good portion of these organizations to like not necessarily just hire everyone back, but these organizations are also the reason why their spaces do not look diverse, don't look inclusive. They have to take that on themselves to reimagine their teams. And this is an opportunity to do so. Not that I'm trying to like take anyone's job or do anything like that, but what I'm just saying is these organizations do need to reimagine what their programming team looks like. And now they've been kind of handed a situation where they kind of have to do that in this new age. And do you just rehire your completely white programming team? I would say no. I think it is an opportunity to like change up the makeup of your organization and like redefine your mission statement and redefine what your goal is and what your community means. And like, that is the one thing this pandemic has handed. Yes, it's financial hardships for a lot of people, but it's also an opportunity to rebuild. A lot of the conversation is about like reinvestigating and changing new normals. So like, what do you want your new normal to look like?
That's a really great point. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, we've all spoken about the opportunity, but I'm sure there have been challenges. I like what you're saying, Faridah, where you're like, okay, yeah, you're being opportunistic, but maybe here in the Global South, besides the opportunity that we can access wider communities and audiences, there's that whole issue of, and it's come up very recently in my other work, data. The cost of data, you know, and whether our audiences will be able to sit in front of their laptops or anything for, you know, an hour or an hour and a half or go through 3 hours of programming. You know, there is that reality. And I've been keeping my fingers crossed that I don't lose any electricity as we're on this panel. But there's also stuff like that that I have to think of, that even when we go virtual, we also have to consider. And then as people whose audiences are queer, I think, and we felt this in so many regards, is the importance of space. It's the importance of the space that our festivals offer us. And now with the pandemic, there are young people who are forced to live with their parents, or individuals who are homophobic. So even if we do program, they might not have the liberty to enjoy queer content in the way that they are. I know in Nairobi, people would just sort of flock to the festival just to meet other people, to watch together. I remember there was one time a group of young Somali gentlemen walked in, and that was the first time I'd seen queer Somalis in Kenya. The festival offered them that. Virtual, yes, there are pros and cons, but it was also just this conversation is really making me think of what we're losing thanks to the pandemic in this regard.
Thank you, Kevin. That's an important aspect to share, and one that I'm glad that we touched on. Since the global uprising, of course, many film festivals and arts organizations have made public statements in support of Black Lives Matter and racial justice. Unfortunately, at the same time, just like Faridah mentioned, it's true that since lockdown, we've seen festivals trim down their staff and rely on a skeletal programming team. Usually those folks who have retained their positions, in many cases, are majority white, while the short-term seasonal roles that do not pay a living wage are designated for the programmers of color. I want to talk about for a moment, how can we hold those organizations and festivals accountable to get beyond their vague statements about anti-racism and dismantling white supremacy and actually see change as it relates to film festival programming? Do any of you have opinions on this?
Well, I think I'll start then. Yes, I have a bunch of opinions, and the first thing that I want to bring is data. I may be speaking specifically about Brazil, or about something that up in the north is easier to find, but data is a way to generate accountability. And by data, I mean, who are the people working for these organizations? Is this information free, shared to everyone, or not? What is the process of hiring? Is it open? Is it, I mean, the nuances of it, is everyone familiar with or not? At least in Brazil, we struggle a lot with data, because these jobs and these roles, it feels like they're designed to only specific bodies to reach them, to access them. So if you don't have, at least in Brazil, if you don't have data on race, gender, class, and sexuality, it's very difficult to hold organizations accountable. Up until very recently, we had major film festivals that did not count on the films, the race and the gender of the filmmakers who were submitting the films, for example. So if you don't have that, you don't even know if you had more diverse films, if you had more diverse staff than you have now. So to me, data is something it's something that is measurable, because data allows us to get the conversation louder and stronger. Another thing that's very important to me is the commitment that these organizations have to have in forging upcoming professionals. You cannot wait that people will just appear by magic. Speaking specifically of Brazil, we've had throughout the years a lot of film criticism workshops, and those workshops, they've helped the arrival of new voices, of radical voices, of diverse voices, voices that are now, for example, migrating to programming. But I'd like to see these film festivals holding, for example, curatorship workshops on a regular basis, and not just like this film festival or that film festival, but film festivals at large, because that is something, and of course, holding curatorship workshops, having a diverse approach to it, thinking about the people that you're going to select to attend those workshops. That's like basic, but it needs to be said. So I think those are two things that are, and establish and set goals and missions and numbers that's a way to move away from how ethereal the conversation can be. Yes, I am committed, I am anti-racist, so show me the numbers. I want to see the numbers, I want to see the data. So these are some of the ideas that I have. And speaking specifically of Brazil, which I realize that is a very parallel reality compared to other places in the world.
Thank you. Measurable goals, curator workshops, that's all great stuff. Did anyone else want to weigh in here? I know it's a topic that we all have a lot of opinions on, so don't be shy.
I was just going to say the goal has to be transparency. A good portion of our industry is just veiled. And some of it's like very basics, like what does a programmer do? But like, it's like these organizations use kind of a veil to avoid accountability. Being way more transparent about who's on your staff, who's on your programming team, who's selecting things. And then like, again, and some of it's data, and some of it's, yes, having hard numbers that are publicly available. So like, you're not just accountable to the people in your room, you're accountable to people who your audience is. And then your audiences will keep you accountable. And I think that is the one thing that we, like as an industry, need to work on. And then on the education piece, and this kind of goes back to the point Kevin was making, a lot of education programs do depend on data and having access to internet. And like, to be honest, in the United States, while data is an expected thing, it's not a public utility. So like, there's a lot of people who don't have access to internet. So like, how can we build our education programs to like also take into account like the limitations of the people we're actually reaching out to? Like, who are you reaching out to for education programs? It's not just like, all right, if you're going to a school that's pretty well off with students who already have access to certain things, or are you going to spaces where you may have to provide access to those students or to those individuals? And moving beyond just like younger education, like who else are you educating? Because education doesn't end after you're in primary or grade school or high school. Some people didn't have access to it before. What are you doing to help the people professionally and educating wise outside of that? Like, if you're going to build new programmers, are you starting when they're 10, or are you looking at people who already probably have the POV that you're looking for, but just have not been given that access before? And like, how do you reach out to those individuals? How do you find them? How do you find those voices? It also goes into how you program, of course. It's also like, who are you programming for? Where are you picking the films that you're choosing from? But like, it also has to go to how you staff and how you educate people. Film festivals, if they want to be these hubs of like film understanding, need to expand where the reach is, and how they expand their reach very much is dependent on who's doing that. And that's where it comes back to like, be transparent about your organization. If your organization, and it's not just your programming team, but if your education manager is a person with a very specific background, if your engagement manager is a person with a very specific background, you're only going to get certain voices. So like, it's about diversifying your staff in general. And then that is the reason why transparency is necessary, not just like, hey, we added another person of color to your programming team, but the rest of our staff is not. That's not a safe environment for your programmer, A. And then also, like, it does mean that your organization is going to fail in other ways. So like, looking at the ways to diversify your staff so that you can diversify what you're offering. And that requires a level of transparency.
Well said. You bring to mind something that I just read this morning, which is there was an announcement in the trades that a major Canadian film festival announced that it will be hiring 2 BIPOC film programmers. And this announcement was met with a lot of fanfare and celebration, but a closer look actually led to the realization that there was no salaries for these positions. They'll provide a small honorarium. And the job description was essentially that these 2 programmers had to watch every short and feature submission to the festival. So that's a massive workload with very little compensation, and it just kind of continues the frustration and the inequities that keep coming up here. Hebe, did you want to jump in on this topic as well?
I just want to take on something that Faridah said, which involved the audience. And I was in a different panel a couple of days ago talking about, you know, how to create more opportunities in general for films. And I think one of the other parts of this equation has been the audience. I mean, how we can get the audiences more invested in that transparency, in, you know, creating the opportunities. I think if we do not, you know, brainstorm more, and I think we have this conversation at some point in different, you know, markets and film festivals, and at least I've been very vocal about the fact that, you know, this, I call it the triangle of, you know, you have the filmmakers, you have the programmers who select, but you need the audience, and the audience needs to be involved. They need to request more. We need to know more about them. We need to reach out to them, but they need to also tell us more and create also different opportunities. I think the time of just showing films in a theater or waiting for, you know, certain powerhouses, you know, let us bring the certain materials. I've been an advocate for Latin American films since I moved to the United States, and I've been, you know, fighting really strong for bringing, you know, those films that, you know, maybe many big festivals didn't want, and I, you know, I fought for those. But it's like always going into, like, you know, like that stream, and I think that's the model we all need to kind of, I wouldn't say throw out of the window, but we need to be as creative as we are in producing the films, in how we can find new ways of showing films, how to make people, I don't know, you know, create, you know, more community environments where people actually, we can help them, you know, by giving them certain films, maybe create minor, you know, mini festivals, mini, you know, series in those places where maybe there is only one computer, and maybe, you know, you will have more people watching, you know, that specific content that it's so difficult to, you know, show in a bigger festival. So we need to change our minds respecting, you know, the audience equation of this. And I keep saying this also because the number of films that have been made, it's a lot, and a lot of those films are never seen by the people. And we are investing money, years, in many cases, public funds, and that, I think, it's not sustainable unless we start investing the same creativity and, you know, money, if we have it, in the audience, and understanding the audience, getting closer to the audience, and making them invested in the production of this content that applies to them. Because it's, you know, the time where people just sit on a theater and, you know, the story is there, I think it's over. And this pandemic, it's just like, this is it. It's either we change the way we think, and, or I think we, you know, things are not going to change ever, because we keep on saying things, but the audience equation, the part of the equation, has not really changed much. And I think that, to me, is like the key, you know, to open doors.
That's great. And that brings to mind this sort of radical idea that you could have communities voting for what kind of content they want to see more of, whose stories they don't get to see. That would be a very powerful message to festivals, I think. There's a filmmaker who I admire very much, Effie Brown, who spoke recently about how organizations, companies, etc., can be actively anti-racist, and her words were hire, mentor, and invest, specifically with regards to BIPOC folk. I wanted to talk for a moment about examples of mechanisms that exist at festivals and arts organizations that serve as barriers to entry, that actively exclude people of color. Let's all use our imaginations and consider being brought into those organizations and festivals to disrupt the status quo. How would you alter those programs or those structures in order to implement an anti-racist philosophy?
I'll jump in because like this is kind of like what I've been working on personally. But in terms of barriers to entry, I didn't have a film school background, and I did not have access to film education in that kind of way. And there is a kind of educational bias, which often comes with class, and class often comes hand in hand with race, and especially in the United States, bias that comes to film programming. And I think some of the ways in which I got into programming by working in operations at different festivals. Most of the people that I work with at festivals who I've met in programming did not go that way. They did not make their way through the ranks learning the ins and outs of festivals. A lot of them came out of film school and like programmed at their schools and then came into the space. I think we need to look for programmers from different places with different backgrounds. It shouldn't just be a person who knows the entire background of Fellini. I like Fellini films. I don't know why I keep bringing up Fellini when I mention this, but like, I grew up on like The Last Dragon with like Timac, but I could also speak to you about the value of having a film that blends Asian cultures and like Black culture and like the ways in which we can have conversations about those communities in the United States and how that plays off in that film. I can have that conversation. I don't think all of the other programmers that I've worked with have even seen this film and can have that conversation. But that is a film that is popular with certain audiences. So like looking for people, but some of it's also just like language bias, but like looking for people beyond. And I think it's about building more opportunities for people to learn about programming. I didn't know what programming was until I started going to festivals. And I only started going to festivals because I wanted to see free movies. Like, it is about finding those individuals who probably would be amazing fits for this space, amazing voices to this space, and doing that. Like, because that educational bias, that expectation is a very strong bias. I meet so many people who would be, and that's also a barrier to entry for audiences as well. I meet people who are just like, I'm not going to a festival because that's a thing for rich white people to go to. That's like a thing in the United States. Like that's what they see. Or a film student goes to that. That's not something that I want to do. And I'm like, but your story is on screen. I'm programming so that you can see yourself, but you don't see that space as a welcoming space. So like there's this weird elitism to a lot of the film festivals, and they project that because again, they don't want that transparency to see some of the stuff behind the curtain that's not always the nicest or the fun. But like, so like the barrier for entry for me, a lot of it's class related. And then the ways to fix that is to like create fellowships, build spaces that reach out to different communities that like show them what programming is, show them what the festival is. I'm always going to push for levels of transparency and levels of access. Access is really my ultimate goal. I'm developing a fellowship that's going to be remote and focusing on people of color. And like the goal with that is to just bring people into explaining what programming is, like how to program, giving them professional development so that they have access. Because like the first programming jobs most people get are kind of like Lucy was mentioning, pay very little or nothing. And most people can't afford to do that. So like finding a way to get people involved that is not a financial hardship is also something that I think will help disrupt the industry. I feel like I went in multiple circles, but my point is just like making it finding ways to make the industry more financially stable. So people who do not have the financial background to support themselves in this industry works, and that will ultimately make it more inclusive. And then also just reaching out to different types of scholarship in finding film, because not everyone has that traditional background, but lots of people have tons to say about how they engage with and inhale media. And right now, the way people are hired is through very specific channels. And I think that's a way to disrupt who we hire and how we educate the people who are brought into the system.
Thank you. Yeah, there is this tendency for festivals to focus on these very polished manager types for leadership positions at festivals. And I'm really interested in how we can disrupt the definition of who is hireable. What different ideas would an artist or an activist bring to this role, for example?
I want to jump in. Allow me, Hebe, I know that you opened the mic, but just because Faridah just said, Faridah brought some points that are very like dear to my heart, you know, what she calls like when you mention fellowships, that's exactly what I mean by workshops. You know, that's the active engagement. But not only that, two things, like not getting paid or not getting decently paid is a form of privilege. It's a way of tunneling. It's a way of not hiring certain people. I remember, like, I have a friend of mine who works as a programmer. She said, I don't have the privilege of not getting well paid, you know, because I don't have the financial background. So when you don't pay well,
Am I still connected?
I think something happened with Heitor's camera or connection.
Yeah.
Then let's have someone else jump in and then he can come back once he's rebooted his Wi-Fi.
I'm going to just follow on what Faridah and Heitor said. I think this idea that oh, hello, Heitor, you're back. So continue.
I don't know until, sorry, I don't know up until what point you heard me. So if you want to continue, Hebe, I pick it up later.
No, I was just picking up on you and Faridah, and I agree with you. I think there is something there is a connection, straight line between the money that festivals and any organization puts in programming in general, and you know what kind of persons you get. And I totally hear when you say it is privilege, because if you don't have someone who actually pays your bill, it's very difficult to sit for hours in, you know, like for hours and hours and hours. And when I started as a volunteer. This is how I started programming in the United States. And why could I do that? Because I have some savings. And I was able to actually sit in front of the TV watching films. But, you know, the reality of today, you know, things have changed, but still the programming aspect of a festival is always, you know, not that they don't put a certain amount, but it's always a minimum. You put more in many other areas. And I think that's something we need to change collectively. This idea that, you know, programming, or is watching films, you know, we can do it, you know, for free. And many festivals still, in order to go through zillions of submissions, they actually need free volunteers. That's the, you know, like that's how they build this whole thing. But also some other, you know, areas of the festivals are also, you know, standing on a lot of free labor. And I mean, I love this country, but this is something we also need to revise. And, you know, there is a whole notion that you can actually have a lot of labor for free. And again, we need to think differently in that respect. And talking about how can we disrupt this, I was thinking, and maybe because I've been in many different festivals throughout, you know, my 20 years, I've never been invited, you know, as someone coming from a different culture, being a woman, being someone who has been to any meeting deciding, you know, who was going to be hired for a certain position. And I think this idea of maybe having a seat at the table of when somebody's going to be hired, you know, and have this more rounded, you know, vision of who is going to come into, you know, the team. Sometimes it's like, okay, this person has been hired, and suddenly you have no saying on that. When you've been in an organization for a, you know, number of years, and maybe you can say something about it. And I think, you know, in general, the hiring process for most of these organizations I work for, or, you know, that they put, you know, announcements, it's pretty like behind the doors and nobody really knows, and you don't really know. And, you know, you also know that many times they put a, you know, something out there, they already know who they are going to hire. And it's a little bit for show. And it's sad. It's sad because there is no real competition. There's not something where you and you know, Kevin, Heitor, you know, we are all in a place where we are all competing, which, you know, it's going to be tough, but at least it's, you know, like you said, in other instances, transparent. It's not happening that way. So, you know, unless we start kind of knocking more and making more fuss about the way, you know, people are hired, it's not just the background. And I hear you, Faridah, because I know I don't know all the American films, and I always feel like, oh my God, I'm going to work for an American festival and I don't know the history of, hey, I don't know. And maybe I know more about Fellini because, you know, that was one of the ones I study. And I always felt a handicap on that. But I know I have a lot more to give to a program. I have, you know, a different, you know, vision about many things. But is that moment where when can you really show your whole being? And that sometimes that never really happens, because most of the time also, you know, you go through, you know, automatic machines, or it's just like, you know, sending a CV and being like, you know, it's impersonal. I think more collective way of deciding who is going to be part of a team. You know, it's one of the avenues I see. And again, if you have a festival that has, you know, money from the city or money, hey, where are those people on the table, you know, trying to make a decision? I'm not saying political, I'm just saying, you know, in terms of a community, you know, where is the community deciding a little bit more on who is on top?
Can I
hear you. I wanted to take this back to you and what you were talking about with building awareness of the curatorial practice through fellowship. So let's go back to that.
Okay, thank you. Because to me, that notion is crucial to combat some of the things that Faridah is saying, you know, because so many times I see film knowledge being used as a way to end a conversation and not as a way to begin a conversation. Film knowledge as a way to exercise, as a tool of power, as a tool of exercising power over the other, and instead of inviting the other to this world of thinking about moving images, thinking about film. So that really pisses me off, because since coming from film criticism used a lot this idea of listing the top 10 and knowing everything, this idea of an all-encompassing knowledge, which is bullshit, because that knowledge is a Western-oriented knowledge. So that person that knows everything, in quotes, of one thing, but doesn't know a lot of things. For example, can that person discuss editing and modern understandings of editing outside of the new wave paradigm? Can that person bring a conversation about editing using, let's say, Tukibuki from Djibril Diop Mambeti? Certain bodies with certain backgrounds can have that conversation, but those voices, they keep being put apart and set apart as less important, as less legitimate, and that's crucial, especially when you're dealing with younger people who are beginning. These are markers to keep the younger people out of the gigs, out of these roles, out of these jobs. So this is one major barrier. Another major barrier, at least in Brazil, it's totally related to what Faridah says about class, is language. And language, I mean speaking a second language. In Brazil, only 5% of the people declare themselves fluent in a second language. Only 3% of the people declare themselves fluent in English. Only 3%. And when you go to film festivals and film programming environments, it's a given, or is seen as a given, that of course you speak English, of course you're able to watch these films without subtitles. This is another barrier. So there's so many, when you're combating, to me, segregation, to me is a policy of segregation. So when you're combating segregation, there's so many intangibles that go into it. So there's so many invisible cracks. There's so many invisible things. And lastly is, as a film festival, attend non-white film festivals, because there you're gonna find different paradigms in programming, different understandings of programming, different voices of programming, and people with different backgrounds. You know, people who program not just as, oh, I program because these are the films of 2019, and then I have to have, oh, that film is going to be the daring film. Oh, that film is going to be the film that, oh, the authorship, oh, that director, oh, we're launching that director. People who program with different paradigms. So these are some of the things that I just wanted to compliment.
Can I just ask to the three of you, do you think the type of film that we're programming is also a barrier? Where some people may say, no, this might be too, for lack of a better word, too hood, or too, where some filmmakers may not be able to say, I want to present this, but there are already barriers around the type of film that you represent. Do you think that, am I right in saying that?
Definitely. There's definitely this idea of what a festival film is. And I came into the industry thinking that I was just filmmaking, like that I was in it to find independent film. Like I was just trying to find different voices, but there's definitely this conception of this is a festival type film. And to be honest, I'm a little tired of some of these festival type films. They're not what I watch when I'm home. So I'm like, I want to see some of the other stuff. And I think one of the ways to disrupt the way in which we engage with film is sometimes also breaking down the categories of how we program films. So much of the categories that we use now are very much about that segregation. We're like, okay, this is our Latin American film section, and this is our this section. And I'm like, when I go home, I don't go, ooh, I want to watch a film specifically from Ecuador today. It's like, no, I want to feel happy. I want to feel sad. I want to do this. I want to do that. And if we move away from these categorizations that we currently have and start looking at the ways in which people actually engage with film, you'll probably find that audiences will come to that film. They won't be like, that film's too ghetto. If you tell them that that film is a romance, that's a romance, an action romance, and they come in and they go see Shatas, and that's fine. And that's great for me because Shatas is a very fun Jamaican film. But it is ways in which you can watch different films and how we categorize a language of how we talk about film. For instance, and I'm probably gonna get in trouble for this, but there's a film that a description got ripped on Twitter last night because the description for it that was written up for it online was so not what the film was about. And it's from a French Senegalese woman, and it's a Black young woman's, Black young girl's coming of age story. But the description essentially wrote it in a way that was so problematically flawed that no one wants to engage with it. So how we talk about film and how we categorize films really matters. And that matters to me. I always ask the person, what's your favorite type of film? Whenever I give them suggestions, what's your favorite film? And then I'm like, do you have an issue with subtitles? And usually they'll say no, because they know me and I'll fight them. But then I'll be like, cool. And then I give them suggestions from multiple countries. Because the way that you engage with film is not, hey, I'm just in the mood for a Spanish telenovela. Some of it's that, but telenovelas come in every country. If you want a telenovela, I got you. If you want deeply heart-wrenching story, I got you. And it doesn't have to come from one country. And I think that also affects it because the conception of that's too ghetto or that's not the right energy comes from the fact that we are putting that on there because we are putting them in those categorizations. We're we want to do a specific focus on the African-American South, but that's the only focus in across genres. Why can't we pull those same content and put them the way that people actually choose what they want to watch? And see how that changes the conversation. Not just an urban romantic comedy, it's romantic comedy with Black people in it. And how do you change that? And how does that fundamentally change the way you engage with stuff? And maybe that will result in where all of our potential fully being used. Because right now, a lot of us are being programmed to do very specific things. How do we democratize the programming language so that the films all have a chance? And maybe that'll make it easier to program the harder stuff because the harder stuff will now just be integrated into everyday stuff.
I love that. Thank you. Democratizing the programming language. That's fantastic.
And I'm just going
I'd love to get into
just one thing is follow on what you said, Faridah. One of the things that goes with this ghettoizing of films is the myth of what kind of films people will see if they go to see a Latin American film or a African film. Or I know for a fact that I've been fighting that myth, that stereotype since I started. I said, if I put a film there, I want people to see a great story. I don't care where the film comes from. And I don't want people to believe that a film is from a certain country because it's, you know, whatever, you know, idea they have about it. And I think that, you know, it's connected with what you're saying in this, also in this way. Unfortunately, most of the marketing strategies and publicity, etc., it's easier to put things in between in boxes. This is a problem we have to fight, all of us, because we put things in boxes even if we don't admit it. But it's a lot of more work to put out there a number of films and to say, hey, these are great films, unless you say, okay, well, this is the, you know, African section, and this is the Latin American films, the Spanish speaking. I've been, you know, fighting a little fight myself when they were saying, you know, Latin American, you know, Spanish speaking. And I said, it's more than Spanish speaking. We have a lot, hundreds of native, you know, people and Portuguese and, you know, many more. But that's something that it's so ingrained in, you know, okay, Latin America is Spanish speaking. And I know I speak Spanish, that's my native language, but I have to acknowledge all the other ones. And it's a fight, it's a fight. And the other fight, this idea that festivals are, I'm just mixing a couple of things here, for, you know, other people. And that's a job, you know, every day it's like going and telling people, this is for you, this is, you know, you are on screen for that, and, you know, getting all those barriers out. But it takes a lot of, it takes more work to get out of this labeling and these squares. And it's something, you know, it would be an interesting, you know, workshop or something, you know, with programmers on how to create sections that are more intersectional, you know, in the conception. And maybe this is the time to do it. Maybe, you know, I'm trying to do that. For example, in Cine Latino, I asked purposely another programmer who is African American to say, hey, can you help me find more African Latino, US Latino, you know, content that maybe I do not know myself, because I know I'm missing a lot of great stories, just because maybe I'm not in contact every day with that. So maybe it's, the idea is we ourselves need to start also reaching out more among ourselves to try to round up, you know, this, you know, even if they are still within this ghettos, maybe we can enrich those, you know, to an extent.
Yeah, I think breaking down stereotypes and audience expectations are two big parts of the job as a film curator. Absolutely right. It's not unusual for top tier festivals, the festivals with the most influence, to select films that sometimes feel problematic, whether they're culturally appropriative, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic. Let's talk about how that happens. How unconscious biases can lead to blind spots. And in the field of film programming, how that can result in problematic work being selected. Many of us, as people of intersectional identities, are able to perceive issues that our colleagues are not. So I'm curious if you could share an experience of a time where you had a realization about a film that was being considered for programming that was not shared by anyone else on your team.
Oh boy. Can I start?
Please.
Okay, so I have a bunch of experiences, but I'll mention just one. I'll just share just one. And talking about a big film festival, high expectations, film festival that is held in a theater that holds like 600 seats. And then there's this film, it's like art house, high production values, art house type of film. like signature filmmaker, experienced director. So like that's the film that I'm talking. That's the type of film that I'm talking about. And then I was working for this film festival, this major film festival, this top tier Brazilian film festival. And this film was submitted. And I watched the film. And it was such a crazy experience because as I was watching the film, I was processing things. And we know how racism can sometimes be subtle. So it takes time to process what you're seeing as you see it. So as I finished watching the film, I was like speechless. Then I came down to the living room. My partner was there, and I turned to him and I said, babe, I just watched a racist film. And the moment that I said that, like everything sank. And then that kind of gave me the strength I felt empowered to actually investigate. Okay, so if I'm feeling that this is a racist film, why is it so? So I investigated those feelings and I felt strong about it. Okay, but that's only the step one, because I'm just talking about myself. There are the 4 people in the selecting committee. Then comes step 2, because step 2 is I looked at our spreadsheet. We had the spreadsheet where we kept the scores of films, a very interesting score system. And the scores were like, this film has to be the film festival. This film has to be the film festival. I would like to see this film in the film festival, and I would like to see this film in the film festival. And I was the only one where like, there's no way that we can see this film in the film festival. And then you start processing, and then comes isolation, because I was the only Black person. I was the only person of color in this selecting committee. So then comes the isolation, because it's like, okay, so it's 1 against 4. And of course, in programming involves a lot of arguing and disputing ideas. I know that, but when you have to convince someone of something that is so bluntly self-evident, that is mentally challenging. So the step 2 was like, it was a huge amount of mental and intellectual preparation, because you have to measure your words. Like, you have to raise the concerns that must be raised, but at the same time, you can't be too violent. You can't be too aggressive, because at the end of the day, you want to be heard, and you don't want to be that elephant in the room, the one that, oh, if it wasn't for this person here, everything would be wonderful. But then there is this person that is like, spoiling the party. So it was such a crazy experience. And in the end, there were 5 of us, and as a group, we decided to program the film, because our understanding as a group was that the film community in Brazil had reached a certain level of understanding in the racial conversations that the concerns around this film would be raised once we had conversations around it. That proved to be successful up to a point, because there were specific people in the Q&A after the film, but I'm not up until today, I'm not sure if it was the right decision. I decided I lost it, or I used that as an opportunity. Okay, if you want to prevent this, you have to prevent those healing images. And that was a strategy that in this particular episode, I used to program what Faridah called a non-film festival film. And that non-film festival film kind of changed the history of Brazilian cinema, and particularly the history of Black Brazilian cinema from 2017 on. But that experience of having to, it feels like you divide your mind in so many spots. Like, okay, this is what I really think. But this is like, this part here is how far will I go? But I have to go here, but I have to measure. Okay, I'll go only 5 miles. But, if someone says that thing, I will counter with that thing. Anyway, so it's just maddening, and it's lonely. And it's so perverse, because at the end of the day, the burden is on us. It's like, I'm the one tripping. Like, I'm the one going crazy. While my partners are like, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Oh, I never thought about it. But anyway, so there's this experience that I wanted to, this near maddening experience that I had.
Thank you. That perfectly encapsulated, I think, something that we've all experienced many times. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I think sharing an unpopular opinion with our teams can often lead us to being labeled as difficult. But it sounds like in that case, in that example that you gave, you were able to have the audience weigh in on that complexity, which is a really great thing because it provoked conversation. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'm struggling with a film right now that was done by, I think, a British producer and a British and Dutch producer. And for some people, it seems petty. And there's one line in the film where they say that one of the characters says that homosexuality in Kenya is illegal. And when I watched the trailer, I'm like, no, that's not right. You know, homosexual sex, homosexual acts is illegal. And those are two very separate things. So when I saw the trailer, I felt uncomfortable. And this was like, I think a month ago, I got in touch with one of the producers. I'm like, great stuff, but I'm really struggling with this element of your film because that is the narrative we tried to change when I was a journalist. That is a narrative that is wrong. That people say, you know, yeah, but it's this. He'll say, I remember him saying, you know, but you have to look at it in context. I'm like, there's no context here. Telling someone homosexuality is illegal and homosexual acts are different are two totally separate things, you know. But when you have an audience who don't see themselves on film much and want to be seen, it's one of those things. Do I program? Personally, I don't want to touch this film. Because it is not, it gives us visibility, it represents our scenario, but it's not painting a real picture. If homosexuality was illegal in Kenya, then I would be in the NIC, I'd be in prison, and we wouldn't have been able to host a film festival that shows queer film. You know, so it's one of those things where you figure it is good for us, you know, and it's not, there's nothing graphic, it looks at spirituality and homosexuality in Kenya. But for me, I'm struggling with that element where your first line of the story, I think, is deceptive.
Kevin, you're navigating working in the global south while sometimes programming work from the global north. So how does, to explore what you were talking about a little bit further, how do you manage to use your programming to connect with local audiences without sort of pushing a Western culture or being seen to do so?
I think now that after Black Lives Matter, it's going to be very interesting putting non-Black content on the film festival because there's a heightened awareness of our Blackness, even here in Kenya. You know, where we are looking at the colonizer and questioning our colonial past and saying, no more, you know, we're not doing this, we don't want to watch it anymore. And we have audiences and members of the community who know we see ourselves, we know our stories. So why are we still consuming media that is not meant for us? Where our stories by our filmmakers, you know, where we can discuss that. And I think there is, because the whole premise of outlawing homosexuality came with the British and Christianity. There are questions of identity where we are navigating what African homosexuality or what African queerness is. You know, and when it comes to programming, it's not just enough to say, oh, you know, it's a queer film. And the guy like, yeah, but it's a queer film from another perspective that is so distant from us. Where are our films? What are our terms? You know, initially when I started programming it, and it was just enough just to be able to see two women kissing or to see a trans person. And like, oh yes, we exist, you know? But now we have moved a little bit farther. So now there's that challenge of what I have to think about the content that is non-African, you know, the content that is non-Black. And finding out why is this important for our audiences? Why are we still running to these films? Yet we can bring in, we have the liberty to bring in films from South America, you know, from other minority cultures, that we are able to see ourselves because there is a common thread. you know, and where that form of sexuality, as homosexuality, queerness rather, in a favela might be something that people say, yeah, we have slums here, we know what this is like, you know, without everything being unicorns and glitter, you know, that kind of homosexuality where we know. I think it's important for us to show other realities, and I think for me it's important to show other global South realities, other realities of people of color, because there's a lot more similarity in that. And that way we are able to discuss more, we're able to feel more, and even affiliate more with a global movement.
Thank you. There's a Black British author and journalist by the name of Gary Young, and in his very last piece of writing for The Guardian, he wrote, I'm going to read his quote: "The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it." I wanted to use that quote to launch into our final question, which is, let's use the power of radical imagination to consider an idealized curatorial space where you can select and present whatever content you choose without having to bow to a higher power or explain your decision. What does that look like? How would your time be spent? And who would your audience be? How would you define a successful event? This is for all of you to jump in and share.
I'm just going to say very quickly, I remember when I was at the LA Film Festival, and I like a lot of films that didn't make it, and everybody was like, okay, that's going to be in the Ebes Film Festival one day. And it was kind of a, you know, joke, because, you know, everything that was not quite for the festival, it was going to be my private one. And of course, I don't want to have a private festival. To me, the answer is support and money, because, you know, you cannot actually do, and we were, you know, in a way we're going back to the financial aspect of this, and how this really either opens doors or closes them. And, you know, I can see a festival where I can, you know, hire many more programmers, where I can go out and try to have more community, you know, screenings, where I could outreach to the audience and ask, you know, more questions about what kind of, you know, films they want to see. I can see a festival where I can dedicate more, you know, money to, you know, promote the films that I already, you know, selected collectively. But at the very end, when I see it in general, at least in the festivals here, is like, we don't have the money. And I feel, unless we also start finding other ways of supporting ourselves in, again, some kind of creative way. And when I'm saying creative, what else can we do to create the resources for this? Because, you know, everything is beautiful, but there is a moment where we need that platform. We need to pay, you know, that screen that's going to be in the outdoors. We need to have the portable porta potties to, you know, for the, I mean, there is a financial equation that it's very difficult to change the content if we do not democratize the resources and where they're coming from. Because we cannot be blind to the fact that, and, you know, mainly for, I've seen it in the festivals in the United States, you know, when you receive money from A, B, and C, they want to see A, B, and C, you know, for their pictures and for their materials, etc. And that's something, you know, or if you're a festival, you know, X festival, you want certain type of films to be shown because that's what you're known for. And so certain international content goes, you know, second class because you're not that festival for that. So those are class, but also just literally economically financial determinants of what kind of festival you can do. So give me the money, I can give you, you know, the most beautiful festival ever. I mean, I have hundreds of ideas in terms of how, here you have, all of us can work together, and create an amazing festivals, but everybody will be like, okay, but, how much you can give me to start working on this? Because watching films takes time. Selecting, it doesn't happen in the vacuum of, let's do it. So find a different way of supporting the festivals.
I was
Who
gonna
else wants to jump in on this one? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that, like, if I had all the resources, all the money in the world to design my own magical place, I tend to lean a little bit more pop culture-y than my film festival spaces. So, like, for me, I'd want to build a series of film series that would look at the ways in which my biggest interest is the intersection between culture and media. And to find culture, a lot of that requires you to engage somewhat with popular media, and not necessarily independent. So I would want to do the intersection of both. I would like to see independent, like, romantic comedies and then have culture conversations. Because like romantic comedies are very plain, like blueprints to culture, ultimately. They're blueprints to comedy, and they're blueprints to, like, it's world building, because you know how the film's gonna end. So like you essentially get to learn about different worlds. Or like do a study on the film Perfect Strangers, which did a lot of film festival circuits a few years back, but it's been made in 10 different countries. The same basic premise of the film. So like for me, I want to use film as a way to understand culture, especially like American culture. Largely, I grew up under this condition. I'm Nigerian American. I grew up thinking, oh, I have so much in common with like my Korean friends and like my Greek friends, my Italian friends. And then I started to realize, oh no, we all have something in common. The one who's the outlier is America. So like I need to figure out what it means, defining what American culture is. So much of the language of what is American culture is not actually being like looked at. American culture, when in the United States, treats everything else like an other. But like when we have like a very distinct culture, especially in the pandemic, I would love to create a film festival that kind of looks at that, like gets to the bones of like what truly makes American culture that kind of way, and how we can reshape it. And like that's what I think film festivals have the power to do, have conversations about culture as a way to, like, I don't know, change it, carve it, shift it, like confront it, and then have conversations about how we want to move beyond it. And that's what I would like to do with a film festival, is like engage people in conversations about these films that we love, that some of the films that we hate, and like why and how we do that. And I think that's the power of film festival. And as a programmer, I want to bring to a space.
Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to have a lot more outreach work involved in the programming. Show the films in spaces that we don't have access to. Like Faridah, when you said earlier on that film festivals are those kind of people things, and Hebe, you mentioned community. And that's got me thinking, taking like for us, getting out of the Goethe Institute and going out to spaces that our audiences would watch film, going back to the day of having a van and putting up a screen in a neighborhood, and then for me, it's not just that. To complement this, you have to be able to have those films in the language of the people. So I would do a lot of subtitling. I would do a lot of voiceover work in African languages, in other Kenyan languages. For me, bruh, there's magic there. When you not just see, but you hear it in a language, or you hear it in a voice that you relate to, the walls, especially in homophobic environments, come down faster. Because you made the film may be different, but it just shows that we are taking the time to think of whom we are showing our work to. So for me, that's what I'll do.
Well, as for myself, I wouldn't just think of a film festival. I would think actually as film programming, and film programming lasting through time and lasting through the year. So I think of film series. So the perfect gig, first of all, I'm taking for granted that I have the money, so I'm not going to even touch the money issue. because I agree 100% with what Hebe said, you know, because it's all about the money. Give me the money and I'll give you the world, because, you know, I'm a genius. Kidding. But like, we're geniuses. We have a lot of interesting ideas. Just trust us and give us the money. But anyway, going back to what the perfect world would be, I would spend a lot of time connecting films, connecting with films and connecting with people, because I know that as a programmer, I have my strengths, but I also have my weaknesses. There are so many spots and blind spots, or spots where I need to improve, or films coming from certain places that I need to improve. And I feel like I don't have enough time to invest myself, my energy and my intellect and my emotions in connecting as much as I would like to do. So this is one thing that I would totally do. One thing that I would do on a permanent basis, and that's why I said, like, I don't think of a film festival, but rather programming throughout time, because I see this as a day-to-day job, as a week-to-week change, you know, not just that event that changes and then goes away. But anyway, one thing that I would totally do is reorganizing film history and film hierarchy. How do we learn film? Through which films and through which filmmakers we learn film? Why do we perceive film as something distant? Why do we perceive film learning and film knowledge as something different? And I think programming has a role in changing that. So I would totally reshape, and I wouldn't show a film by Maurice Pialat again and again and again and again. You know, I would show other stuff. So changing, playing with the notions of center and periphery, inhabiting the periphery, not just putting the periphery in the center, but fuck the center, like concentrating your attention in the periphery. So this is something that I would, I'm very committed to creating, and speaking as a Black Brazilian, as a gay Black Brazilian, creating in spaces run by us, basically like what Solange says, for us, by us, like run by us and thought for us. Taking us into consideration, taking our subjectivities, our histories, our bodies, our looks, because in Brazil, I don't look like a programmer. I'm a programmer. I've worked 14 years in this business, but I don't look like a typical programmer, a typical film critic. And there are a bunch of people who look like me, who look like us, and they look at programmers and they say, but I don't look like them. So how can I become a programmer? And lastly, I even wrote this one, like, how do you define a successful screening? Because to me, that's something that is very, very important. So I would define a successful screening as an event where people would feel that they are welcome to return, even when facing uncomfortable images. And that cinema, or the world of moving images, is for them as well, not as a distant thing that only privileged, intelligent, white people who are middle-aged, have beard, wear glasses, and dress in a very uncreative way can inhabit. So that's what I would define successful. That's how I would define as a successful screening. People coming back. People like me coming back. Younger versions of myself coming back.
Can I add one more thing? I know we're running out of time, but one of the things that I will put, if I have all the money and I can do that, one place where I would make movies like an everyday thing is schools, kids. I always talk about infecting kids with the virus of good cinema, of good stories. I always refer to the anecdote that my mom used to take me to museums. And at the beginning, I, got maybe bored or, and she would take me to see films that I didn't understand, but I was exposed. I had that opportunity, just to be there, to listen to different kind of music. If we don't do that with films are going to be strange for some people, and they are going to feel like the films are not for them. So if we don't show, films should be part of, like you have math and you have physics, and then you have movies, and you can show all types of films. Because if you start when the kids are kids, nothing is strange for a kid. And any kind of story, any kind of character, any kind of relationship, it's natural. But when you start, at the end, then you have to start explaining, oh, this is this, and this is how it works. But when the kids, you show whatever, they take it, they enjoy it. You know, and it's one of the beauties of, for example, I go a lot to children plays and special musical plays, and kids get engaged in the story and the characters in a way that, of course, you see it again in films, but because it doesn't happen as often, you know, again, you grow up, a lot of our audiences grow up with just one type of film that, again, all of us collectively have to start working again, you know, how you disrupt this idea of what a story it is and who has to be portrayed in the films, etc., etc., etc. So for me, if I had the money, I will make free screenings, you know, paying the filmmakers and everybody, but free screenings in every single school and any place where kids gather, anywhere in the world.
I love that. This topic makes me think of the words of Sarah Ty Black, who spoke on the TIFF panel last year about decolonizing the screen. She talked about BIPOC folk as the marginalized majority, and she imagined a world where women of color are in leadership positions at festivals and arts organizations all across the world. So I just want to hold that image up there for all of us to consider. And personally, I would like to see funding for independent art curators like yourselves to bring all of your ideas to life. Thank you so much for being generous with your time and your thoughts today. Do any of you have parting words that you want to share before we close?
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It was amazing. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And thank you. Thank you, the people of Carla and Themba, for, you know, making this happen. I think, you know, and I hope literally I open and I use this forum for, you know, I know all of you, but, you know, again, if you want to suggest, you know, films to me that I, you know, haven't seen that I should, please do so, because that's how we start. And thank you, Lucy.
You're welcome. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to close with the words of Gemma Desai, a London-based film programmer and another member of the collective, whose study, This Work Isn't For Us, has been essential reading for me during the quarantine. Gemma said in the closing pages of her essay, "The world is collectively demanding an end to harm, an end to racialized and all inequality. The world is collectively raging at those who have for too long enacted exclusion while performing benevolence. The world demands that those who have excluded now tell the truth." To everyone watching this, you were drawn to the Carla 2020 conference because you care about equity and inclusion, and maybe you want to know how you can do better. Thought-provoking conversations like the one we just had can be happening among your teams if you build an inclusive staff. Let's all of us consider the question, who are film festivals for? Do you believe that your festival has a responsibility to serve your local community? And if so, who are you missing? Who doesn't feel seen and heard in the work that you've been programming? Who doesn't feel safe even engaging with your organization? And how can you change that? Thank you for joining us.